all these people around here hate this house, and I think it's a very conservative house. Has been just rebuilt recently. You see the house being built across the street. It's a shame, in my view, that in the end of the 20th century, we are trying to copy architecture. Fake architecture was done at the beginning of the century, but unfortunately there's lack of culture, I think, very much. So all these people around, well, in the city, everybody here, neighbors and architects and planners in the city, think that this house does not, that it's an ugly house, which may be ugly, but at least, I don't see why it should be a copy of these fake Tudor houses that surround us. And something you learn in going to the Middle East, for example, is how creative and how much risk people will take in the Middle East, not unlike South America. And of course, you make mistakes, but at least the Paris Opera was to try to do a very complex new building, which was really a machine, because it had to have 3 halls, one for 2,700 people, another one for 1,800, another one for 500, and another one for 250, plus a very complex machinery to create and move sets and decors and so on. All this huge machine, 150,000 square meters, and very high volumes, because you needed, the main hall, the stage is about 50 meters high, with huge elevators to move these machines and so on. All that one had to be built in a city that is very small scale, in a neighborhood that has very small scale, because the Bastille is not from the 19th century when Haussmann changed all Paris, but it's from the old part of Paris. And the idea was to break this big building into smaller components, so that there would be a better symbiosis between the new building and the neighborhood. So the idea was to break the building in volumetric shapes, half cylinders for the halls, cubes for the stages, vertical volumes for the stairs and elevators, and large free forms for other spaces like the workshops. And this broken architecture and volumetry would integrate better, I thought, with the neighborhood. Unlike the Centre Pompidou, which is a big machine, not only different in volume, but also in color and materials. I like criticism. I think that any artist likes criticism, whether it's positive or negative, because at least there is a reaction to you. And it could be positive, could be negative. The worst thing, I think, for an artist is when you get just indifference and people do not give you their feelings. If you do something and people don't like it, I think it's their right. I think if you do something and people like it, it's also their right. I think the artist, though, however, should always be criticized, because an artist should always be thinking ahead of the general public. I mean, the Van Goghs, the Gauguins, the Cézannes were criticized at their time, but today people pay $80 million for a Van Gogh painting. At the time they were not worth, nobody was worth $500, and poor Mr. Van Gogh died in poverty, because he was ahead of the public. And I think that's been the same with every single form of art, from painting to music to architecture to every single form of expression. The artist is at advance. And if everybody were to like very much what I do, if my neighbors were to like a lot what I'm doing, I'm saying, uh-oh, I'm doing something wrong. My role here is to come up with a different, fresh, newer point of view. And obviously you'll always find a very small percentage of the population that may like the crazy things you do. When Stravinsky wrote music, people did not like his music. They were still thinking about Mozart and Beethoven, but Stravinsky is essential to music. The same with Picasso. Picasso was criticized, and so was Van Gogh. And the same was Frank Lloyd Wright when he tried to change architecture. Today we all admire Frank. Unlike, say, for example, the predecessor, Centre Pompidou, which when Piano and Rogers won the competition, the scheme was completely different than the building. From an artist standpoint, the stage is very small, there's no space for camerinos, and there's no space to prepare props and sets. My Paris Opera is exactly the opposite. The intention was to give the emphasis to the opera itself, to the art itself, to the musical expression itself, so therefore the stage and the backup facilities are very large, so is the hall. While the foyers, although essential, they are not as, how do I say, pompier is called in French, as showy, as gaudy as Garnier's.
Now,
the other antithesis, one is a project for to the end of the 20th century. The other one was a building for a local architect that basically lent me part of his staff, or I hired part of his staff working under my direction. I wanted to maintain full control of the project. So I hired young students and brought some architects from Toronto and went to an existing firm and got from them people who had experience with Spanish, of course, and French are similar. And in Uruguay, where I was born, French was obligatory in the 4 years of high school. It's a very Francophile country because the whole country was created after the ideals of the French Revolution. So, no, and even my French will always be very bad because I have a very strong Spanish accent. But I could understand perfectly well from day one, and I started, I suppose, improving as I stayed in France. But from day one, my communication... the words that were given to Mr. Mitterrand, as I recall, were, of all the 780 or 800 projects that are here, this is the only one that fully complies with the requirements of the program, with the requirements of the city, that adapts itself to the environmental and urban. We had to respect it till the last end. And maybe to my credit, or to the credit of my team, it was the project that was right on budget. We had to lose some money because this project of the Louvre was much more expensive than originally planned, and we lost money for them and for the funds, I think, a little bit. But La Bastille, we had a very tight budget, which of course, unfortunately, was translated into a control on the quality, on the type of materials. Sometimes the Paris Opera has been mentioned as a postmodernist. To be postmodernist means is bringing elements from the past and using them in contemporary architecture. I never liked postmodernism. I come from a modernist school which followed the Bauhaus, and as I said to you before, Le Corbusier's ideals and Gropius's ideas were very much followed in North America, and in North America we do not do fake colonial architecture or like these neighbors in Canada, and I hate that, and that's why this house I don't think is postmodernist. I did not think that the Paris Opera was a postmodernist, although in France has been dubbed as postmodernist. What I do, postmodernism, I think, tried to break with the very strong canons of the modernist theory, and perhaps to a certain extent open up the discussion and the speech about it. But the result, I mean, if the architecture of postmodernism is architecture that I see, I'm not sure if, in addition to the National Gallery in London, I'm totally against. I'm a modernist. I like future. As I said, I like modern architecture. Today, I admire the architecture of modernists, and to modernists, I'm thinking, to give examples, someone who is not very modernist, but has a very pure and simple architecture, to me, is Tadao Ando from Japan. Or I prefer the architecture of Norman Foster. Okay. I say, well, I cannot. Who can do architecture like Norman Foster? Who can convince a client to spend the money he spent in Hong Kong in the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank? I won't go to that extreme because I think it's a bit exacerbated. But at least there's a research. I like the architecture of Renzo Piano. Zaha Hadid won fame in that Hong Kong peak competition, and I think she has a lot to bring to the table. I think she has a very nice approach to it. But what I don't like is etiquettes, labels. Whenever Philip Johnson called deconstructivism or someone calls postmodernist, I do hope that the architecture is much more interesting and goes deeper than the epidermis of the architecture. The epidermis of a building, which was called facadisme in France, was a typical result of the Beaux-Arts, where the architect spent hours and hours and hours designing the facade and never cared about the function behind. And I think that's what the Bauhaus and the modernists brought along, a different look at the whole architecture, not just the skin. Postmodernism goes back to a tremendous emphasis in the facade again, which is Beaux-Arts, to me, is not interesting. And the same with deconstructivism. But I think that the word deconstructivism was coined by Philip Johnson, if I'm not wrong, or Peter Jenks, Charles Jenks, and therefore it's on the theory that I'm away from it. I do architecture as a form of art, and although I have, of course, an intellectual approach towards architecture, from there to make of the intellectual approach the main emphasis, the whole development of Harbourfront, I would have rather hoped that we were going to do something better. Some of the apartment buildings there are a disaster. I think that the planning could, I think that in the ages ago, they did one of the most beautiful harbor centers in the world. It's called Venice. You would think that at the end of the 20th century, we should improve on Venice. Or if not improve, because probably it's impossible to improve Venice, do something as interesting as Venice. So certainly Harbourfront is not Venice. Had I designed Harbourfront, the water, I would have brought water all the way up to King and Bay, up to City Hall. I would have put more bridges, I would have put more islands, I would have put more things. I would not put pompous buildings. And I think that if we were to design today an opera house in Toronto, I would not build it in a corner on Bay and Wellesley. I would put it perhaps on an island like they did in Sydney, in the middle of the waterfront, to bring the city to the waterfront. It's a shame that we have ignored that waterfront. In the development of it, there's some individual elements that are nice, but a majority is a bit of a chaos. Carl Lafrebe was the developer, and Eb Zeiler was the main architect, although many architects participated. Parking did, Berman and Hammond did, and I remember Webb Serafa did in the hotel, and landscape architects. I think it's one of the strong, new, large shopping centers. But again, think about Galleria Vittorio Emanuele in Milano. It was done many years ago. And I'll say one is very elegant, the other one is not. One does not take the pedestrian activity from the city away. On the contrary, it links the piazza of La Scala to El Duomo. The two most important buildings in Milano, the cathedral and the opera, are linked by this building. So this building, rather than fighting against these two buildings, links them and brings them together. I think that was an extent the crisis to Eaton centuries that killed the pedestrian life along the Of course, when you study architecture, you admire everything. Above all, my father, because I was working close to him, and I became an architect because he was an architect. I painted cars because I was 4 years old, 3 years old. I was visiting his sites, and I was making models next to him, and I was painting next to him. And I loved, and I 4 years old, you give me a pencil and a paper, and I was already drawing cars. And of course, in architecture studying, of course, the ones that are close to you are the modern architects. Of course, Frank Lloyd Wright. An aunt of mine had done a house, basically a copy of Frank Lloyd Wright's house. And you immediately look at the architecture. There were very good architects in South America when I was growing up. For example, Niemeyer in Brasilia doing huge buildings and very, very simple, very modern. Candela in Mexico, and of course you start looking at the architecture of the problem of Brasilia is one of the examples of, in my view, the lack of depth in the architect's analysis. Again, if architects just analyze the aesthetical problems, individually, the buildings of Niemeyer are very beautiful, I think, as objects. What I was saying is, Brasilia is an example of the failure of the modernist movement, because the modernist movement, not unlike the Beaux-Arts, stayed on an aesthetical analysis. Niemeyer's buildings are beautiful. The Palazzo, the Planalto are very nice in itself. The cathedral is very nice. But they are an absolutely mistake from an urbanist standpoint. And I think that city fails because it's not a livable city. It was a city that was designed on a drafting table and imposed. And they did not take into account the environment, the sun, the distances, the heat, the people. When a city grows harmonically. And maybe one of the best examples, perhaps, are, to take one example, some of the houses, some of the little villages in the Mediterranean, be it the European coast, be it the African coast, be it the Asian coast, where the cities are like part of the environment. Even in the Sahara, even in a dry country like yours, you can live very well because you build heavy walls and little windows, you try to create shadows, like I'm thinking about Seville or Cordoba, done by the Arabs so nicely. In this case, someone in his ivory tower said, I'm going to be God, I'm going to design this city, and people are going to live there. And the catastrophe of that could have been the same had the plan of Mr. Le Corbusier had been implemented for Paris, because he was going to do the same huge towers. And as a matter of fact, I hate La Défense. I think that you'll agree with me that some of these American cities and Canadian cities are a disaster for the same reason, because someone imposed that solution. Maybe it's one of the great criticisms that you could make of Canary Wharf. And yes, of course. And I've done a couple of projects in London, and I had to face the Royal Commission that he headed with criticisms. On the one hand, I'm sympathetic to some of the criticisms, which is the ones I'm just referring to. But what I do not like at all about his opinion is this passeist, looking at the past as the only solution. When the pharaohs built their monuments, I don't think they tried to copy former architecture. They created the pyramids and the Sphinx and so on. When the Romans built Rome, they did not copy. They were based on the architecture of the Greeks, but they carried a step forward. When in the Middle Ages they tried to create cathedrals, they did not try to copy the Roman churches. They came up with a new architecture. And the same in the classical period, the same in the Baroque. I mean, when the Borrominis, the Berninis, and Michelangelos build their churches, they don't want to copy the Middle Ages. They maybe have an influence on classical architecture, but they certainly change that. And I think that today we have to come up. I don't see why we have to go back like these neighbors here to put the little details that they did in Victorian England. That's where I have a strong objection to the Prince of Wales' opinion about it. With the exception of the Simcoe Place for Cadillac Fairview, and inshallah the continuation of the construction of the federal courts in Ottawa, my involvement in Canada these days is very small. Most of my work is in the Middle East, in Europe. Right now I have no ongoing work here. If the federal courts were to continue, and if I was going to get more work, I would immediately open up an office here in Toronto now, yes.
Okay.
Much of my work now is being done in Germany, in France, in South America. And Mr. Pei is a fantastic artisan, a craftsman, so the pyramid is extremely well built. Particularly he was helped by a genius, which was Peter Rice, an engineer from England, who helped many people, above all people like Renzo Piano and Ian Pei. As an object, it's a very nice object. You are an Egyptian. I'm not. Who am I to tell you what a pyramid is? A pyramid, in the concept of an architect, is a funeral monument. It's a monument that has to be done in a perennial material, in stone, and it's a symbol of many things. That same funeral symbol, which is normally done in stone, and the pyramid is basically Egyptian, although amazingly enough it's also Mayan and Mexican, although many years later, but for also as a temple. When it's done in glass and transparent in the middle of Paris, and as an entrance to a museum, I don't know. There's no question that when it rains in Paris and you have to line up in front of a little entrance to go inside the pyramid, you think that as an entrance perhaps it's not working very properly. But it was very nicely built. Whether it's appropriate or not around the Louvre, I think that's a long debate, and there'll be a lot of discussions about it. I would have done something different, but of course, I am not Mr. Pei.